Good morning, everyone. My name is Whit Samanak. I am the environment advisor to the assessment project, and it's really important that we have all of the stakeholders here today in this environmental management in the mining sector meeting. As Mr. Impact has shown and stated, it's very important that we hear all of your voices today, and the presentation that I will make here right now is trying to put a little bit about the international perspective, also a little bit about the assessment project, and also how environmental audit fits within the environmental management system. So today, I'll cover the where are we and where are we going. That's very important. As I say, the assessment project to date, the effects of mining on the natural and the human environment, it's so important, that piece, and effective environmental management, and where does the audit fit in. These are the hard questions. So what I want to do, just as I get through this, there's some very hard questions we have to ask ourselves today. Is Mongolia's environmental audit law effective? Is it working? You all have your own ideas on whether that's working or not. Is environmental audit recognized as an important tool in Mongolia? Is that something that people actually utilize? Why do companies in Mongolia that extract natural resources and by law are required to do environmental audit, why aren't they doing it? Why only 5%? That's a very hard question. Why have a law if no one's following this law? Are the results of environmental audits that have been completed, are they being shared with different people? That's a hard question. The next thing is, does anybody check whether any of these audit recommendations that are made, are they actually being implemented? Another hard question. And what improvements are required? And who's responsible and accountable to make sure the change happens? That a year from now, 5 years from now, when we ask these same questions, we don't have the answers that only 5% are actually meeting the environmental audit standards. So assessment so far, in terms of the work that we're doing and trying to connect everything in terms of environmental management, we've been looking at licensing and governance, we've been looking at closure, post-closure, environmental audit, and environmental impact assessment. All of those are connected. And it's very important to ensure and understand what those connections are. And we've been moving forward by identifying the gaps. So as Mr. Impact has mentioned, back in February, we had a gap analysis for the environmental audit. We've done gap analysis for closure and post-closure. So we have an understanding of what some of the gaps are and some of the changes that need to be done. Then we try to build consensus that everybody recognizes that in fact those are the same gaps that everybody understands, so that we can try to work together as all stakeholders, because different stakeholders have different ideas on the gaps. And then we try to build some knowledge through either going to Canada and some of the different missions that have been happened on the audit that was just completed, or one on the closure, or we have workshops here in Mongolia. So we have been trying through the assessment project to build knowledge, build consensus, build support, but also now we have to start moving to the next stage, which is part of this meeting here, is try to get a change in behavior, try to get the change in law to make it more effective. So, mining and the environment, and mining and the human environment. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Why are we here? Just imagine what all these pictures looked like before. The lands that were there. It's so important. You can see the impact of mining. As soon as mining comes, there's going to be an impact on the natural environment, and there's going to be an impact on the human environment. That's why we are here, because if we don't do our jobs right, as stakeholders, everybody keeping everybody else honest, then we will have a lot of issues with respect to environmental issues down the road for future generations. So these pictures show it all. This is why we're here, and this is why we need to do a good job. So this is the typical life cycle of a mine development. This slide is important because it shows you where environmental information has to be collected, because everything is important in terms of a baseline. Even through from the pre-exploration, having some land use information that's required. Once we get into the exploration phase, we need to collect environmental baseline information. What is there? And we cannot just copy and paste from others. We have to do each one individually to be able to move forward. And then as we move into the development stage, then there's environmental impact assessment work that needs to be done. There's also mitigation and environmental protection measures that we put in place. And the closure plan has to be done at the front end. there has to be a closure plan that's in place. Of course, that will change over time and over the life of the mine, but there has to be something done at the front end. Then we get into the operation, where audits become very important because you have to check whether in fact everything that you've said in your impact assessment, what you've said, everything in terms of your environmental protection plans, you have to give the report on whether you're actually achieving and meeting the regulations and meeting the different promises that you've made in terms of the development. You know, it would be like going to school and never getting a report card or a test from the teacher. Audit is so important to be able to give you that test to find where you're at. And that's why if there's no test, then we have no idea where we're at. If we only know 5% is doing something, that's not a level that I think that we want to be at. And then ultimately into the closure, again, it's connected because what was done before through the baseline in terms of closure, it has to be closed and reclaimed to what was the same or better. So that's why baseline is very important in those types of things that are there. So and then we have monitoring and environmental compliance over the long term. So that's the key piece. This is a very simplified picture of environmental management and how all the different pieces come together. This gives you an international perspective. Hopefully I haven't oversimplified this. There is a policy level requirement that's there. This needs to be led by the National Audit Office or the Supreme Audit Institution, so the National Audit Office of Mongolia. They play a very important role. In the middle, we have the environmental information that's generated by individual projects. So there's good legislation, regulations at the bottom. Those are the baseline. If we have good Mongolian environmental legislation, that then generates a good environmental impact assessment, which then will generate environmental management plans, which will then also include the closure, post-closure, and financial assurance requirements. And then the audits will be checking that. The audits will be checking, and that's from the regulatory point of view. In terms of the mining sector generally, worldwide, in a lot of places, there's actually work that's done over and above what's required by regulations. And we have this new initiative that's out towards sustainable mining. So there's a lot of other pieces that have all the audit principles in terms of checklists, in terms of protocols, and people who are actually doing the assessment of those sustainable audits are ones that are qualified and certified. And then we have the sector level piece, which is on the side. Again, there needs to be enforcement of the regulations and of the legislation. And also strategic environmental assessment and cumulative impacts. Because if there's one mine in a region, then that's an impact that one can assess with the environmental. But a second mine that goes in, the environmental impact assessment of the second mine has to also take into account the other mine that's already in place, and it builds one onto another onto another. So let's just look a little closer at some of these audits. There's 4 or 5 or 10 or 15, but I just picked a few key types of audits. There's a performance audit that's done at the national audit level. There's environmental management system audits that are done at the company level. There's compliance audits that are being done, and also these sustainable audits. Let's look at a little bit about the National Audit Office or the Supreme Audit Authority. Why are they important? These are copies and covers of reports that have been generated. The one in the middle, there's an international organization of the Supreme Audit Institutions that have all the Auditor Generals and the National Audit Offices from most of the countries around the world are part of this organization. They have developed a handbook on how to audit mining. That's how important the mining sector is. So this document is available, and the National Audit Office in Mongolia is one of the ones that should be looking at that to be able to see that. The ones on each side are 2 Auditor Generals who have actually audited the mining sector. So remember, this is a bar that's on the side that I show you. These are very important in terms of to be able to show you. Because what do these audits do that comes from the National Audit Office, that comes from the Auditor Generals, is that they make sure that legislation is harmonized. They make sure that international agreements are looked at. They also ensure that there's effective mechanisms that are in place. National environment programs are properly funded, and they also ensure that through the work that they do, that there's a catalyst for change. The results of this is very important because ministries generally have to be checked. on whether they're doing their job, whether you're the Ministry of Mining, whether you're the Ministry of Environment, and that's what the National Audit Office does. Because a lot of times, in terms of the recommendations from some of those reports that came out, they saw that the Ministry of Mining has a conflict of interest if you're auditing the different laws, because on one side they're promoting mining, on the other side they're supposed to be controlling how that mining is developed. And that's a conflict. So they provided recommendations on how to reconcile those conflicts. Also, they see that there's lots of ministries are fighting. There's power between, let's say, the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Mining, and how to ensure that there's effective environmental protection and effective development of the mining sector is to build a one single window approach where all the environmental information is brought in so that mining companies have a clear path to be able to move forward. They're also there in place when something goes wrong, because a lot of times we had a major failure in BC of a tailings dam, and the people were saying, how come the Ministry of Environment, how come the Ministry of Mining weren't there to prepare and weren't there to make sure that this wasn't going to happen? The National Audit Office was the only one that could come in to be able to look at and see, because ministries were always trying to, well, you know, maybe it might not be my fault or it's their fault, so the Audit Office was the one to be able to actually determine what was going on. And also they do things such as financial assurance reports, trying to figure out whether there's enough money put aside to actually reclaim. So this is the example from a financial part of it. This goes on for 5 pages. This is from one province in Canada. So there's lots of mines. These are all the mines that are listed. This is information on how much money they put aside in terms of their bonds, financial assurance. And then the National Audit Office, or the Auditor General's Office, actually estimated how much it would actually cost to close the site properly. And there's a big difference. So this just shows you mine by mine whether everyone is equal, whether the bond equals what they think that the reclamation and the closure will be, and whether there's a shortcoming. So at the end of the day, this is after 5 pages, you can see that the government has about 1 billion Canadian dollars in bonding, but they actually need another $1 billion, 1.2 billion. So there's a big shortfall. So who's going to pay for that? If the mining companies generally have put aside this much, and then you have $1.2 billion, who's going to pay for that? How did we get into this situation? Why did, between the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Environment, and Ministry of Mines in British Columbia, in this province, how did they get where there's such a big difference? That came out through the auditing of environmental information by the National Audit Office. So that's very important to have that part of that there. So you can see that's that sidebar that controls and actually keeps in check the ministries and how they do their work and whether that legislation is effective. So they are a very important player. So now we also have here the different importance of audits for mining companies, because this is where you ensure that the baseline information from the environmental impact assessment and the environmental management plans, the environmental protection plans, the regulations that are there, that they are actually taken care of. That's why you want to have that environmental audit moving forward. And it ensures accountability of the company and of the management of the operation. And it also ensures that there's ongoing control mechanisms that are effective to make sure that things are going forward. Again, because we have environmental audit or this type of report card, this is the catalyst of change. But it's all connected back to the original baseline of environmental information that's collected, the environmental impact assessment, the work that's being done on the closure plans. So you can see how impact assessment, environmental audit, environmental protection plans, they all need to work together, and the environmental audit fits to be able to make sure that the delivery is there, that it's not just promises. And it's important that the people that are affected by an audit and the results of an audit, that the various stakeholders get that information. I just want to show you a little bit. I was involved and helped through the assessment project take the Mongolian team to look at audit in Canada. And we did visit mines. So I want to give you an example of one mine. So now we're in the center block of that effective environmental management and how one mine does its program. So this is a large company called Glencore. This is a big company, and here you have their audit program that they undertake. So they have sustainability audits, which is over and above what the regulations require. They also have environmental audits that they do within themselves. and they also have a special community piece where they reach out. But it's all governed at the end here. They're very, very sensitive to what's required by regulations. So this just gives you an idea. This is from their presentation to us when we were all there. These are all the regulations that governs their mine and their mill and their smelter. So they have them all listed out. So they know exactly what each regulation requires them to do. So they have it at one level of government. The blue is at one level of government, it's the national government, and the green is at the provincial government. They have it all listed. So this is, again, that base. Remember that figure I have? That's the base. Good legislation, good regulations, because now the mining company knows what they need to do. It's very clear. So it goes on for pages. They have all of these different regulations that they need to go through, and they're well aware of them, very well aware of them. And then they come up with a summary of the different audits that they actually undertake, and you can see that there's a number of different audits. So when we look at audits in Mongolia, how many different audits can there be? Is it just compliance audits? Is it just EMS audits? There's many audits. There's greenhouse gas audits. There's health and safety audits. There's many different audits that have environmental implications. So this just gives you one page, gives you a summary of the structure that they use and how some of them are actually done by themselves on their own as a voluntary basis, and some that are required legally. Also, there's a new initiative now, that's not so new, towards sustainable mining. So this is over and above environmental regulations. The mining sector generally recognizes that they have to really be engaged with the community. Environmental issues are very important, and this is something that they have to proactively go even more so than what the government might need in terms of the regulation. So the group met with the Mining Association of Canada. This towards sustainable mining, again, as I mentioned, has a number of different protocols. Here they all are. You can see a lot of this relates to community engagement. They also have a whole environment piece, and they have a number of stuff on energy efficiency. Again, same sort of thing. These are audited. There's protocols. There's auditors that basically do this work. And this is over and above the work that needs to be done. So again, you can see how often they have to do these audits. This is the summary. This is the key. We have the national audits. Someone has to check the ministry. Someone has to check to make sure that you're doing the right work, has to make sure that the information is right. They also need to have a secure system in the middle with strong environmental legislation and regulations to be able to build this, to move it forward. In terms of where are we going, this is the thing. We need to clarify the legislation and regulations, because we know right now, is the environmental audit law in Mongolia working? We need to do that and have a definition of the audit types, responsibility, accountability. We also have to recognize environmental audit is important within the entire system. It's an important tool to make sure that the system works, but it's connected back to basic environmental information that was collected at the outset. There needs to be capacity development for auditors and the association. There needs to be enforcement support. And there needs to also be oversight by a national audit office to make sure that everybody is working well together. So that's my presentation.